Hi y'all, it's Teresa in Gemma's house. Well, I recently made a patchwork quilt and free motion quilted it, and part of making a quilt is adding a binding. So I wanted to show you my process that I go through when I'm adding a binding to my quilts. I usually use these jelly rolls, and these are perfect for a binding because they're already cut into 2.5-inch strips, and they have 20 pieces and they're 42 inches long. So it's kind of a good deal to buy one of these on sale because it's pretty much what you would spend on cotton fabric, and they're at least already cut for you. And they have a lot of different patterns and colors and solid colors too. So for the size of this quilt that I'm adding the binding to, I picked out these 10 patterns. And I'm alternating them in a way that you can see the difference between the different patterns. So I'm starting out with the first 2 strips, and I'm putting right sides together, lining up the edges and sewing the seam with a 1/4-inch seam. I always backstitch when I start sewing and when I'm finished sewing on the strip. So without taking the needle out of the fabric, I'm getting the end of the second strip and putting it right sides together with the beginning of the third strip. And again, without taking the needle out of the fabric, I just continue sewing a 1/4-inch seam on these 2 strips. So I continue doing this for all 10 strips. And then it's going to look kind of like a mess, and it's going to look like you made some big mistake somewhere. But all you have to do is cut the threads in between the strips like this. And then you'll see that you have one long strip. So since my quilt was 98 by 98 approximately, I just multiplied 98 by 4, and that's 392 inches I needed for the binding. And if I add about 4 to 6 more inches to that, that would be 398 inches. So since each of these strips is 42 inches, that equals 420 inches. So this strip will be plenty long for my quilt. So now I take it over to my ironing table, and I start by turning under the end of my first strip. And then I fold the strip wrong sides together and iron it flat. And I use a hot steam iron for this. Once I get to the first seam, I finger press it open and then iron it flat. And then resume folding the strip in half, and I make sure this seam is nice and flat. After I'm finished with the whole long strip, I use these cardboard pieces that were inside fat quarters when I bought them at the fabric store. I have a ton of these. You can also use a toilet paper roll for this, or a paper towel roll. And when I finally finish rolling this binding, I just secure it with a pin. Okay, so here's my binding all rolled up on these cardboard pieces. And what I do with my bindings is I sew the binding to the back of the quilt. This is the back of my quilt here. I start down about 12 inches from one of the corners, and with right sides together, of course, and with the raw edge of the binding lined up with the raw edge of the back of the quilt, I start sewing a couple inches down from the end. Okay, so I have my walking foot I'm going to use. If you don't have a walking foot, you can just use your regular sewing machine foot. I use a 1/4-inch seam, and I have the raw edges of the binding lined up with the raw edge of the back of the quilt. And I just have the binding on the card laying loosely on the floor so it can unravel as I need more binding. And I have the bulk of my quilt opened up, and I have it laying on the table so that it's not pulling by hanging down on the floor. And Gemma and her cousin Tessa are at the window guarding. Okay, so here I am at the corner, and I want to stop stitching a 1/4 inch from this edge. So I want to stop stitching right here. And I backstitch a few times and take the needle out of the fabric. You don't have to cut the threads. And fold the binding up so you have a 45-degree angle here. The edge of the binding is still lined up with the edge of the quilt here. And then fold the binding back down on itself like this. The edges are lined up, and the folded end of the binding here is lined up with this edge of the quilt. So I'm going to put the needle back into the fabric right where I left off, right here in the corner. It will be a 1/4 inch away from this edge and a 1/4 inch away from this edge. And then continue sewing. And I always backstitch again, and then continue sewing. So let me show you. This is what it looks like. And then when I turn it, I'll fold under these edges and top stitch it on the other side of the quilt. And I'll show you that later. Okay, so here's that process again of how to sew the binding in the corner. Okay, so now I'm at the last corner, and I just did the corner. So now I'm continuing down, and I'm at the point where I started. So this part of the binding, the edge is folded under. So that's a finished edge. So I'm going to cut the last part of the binding about 1 inch longer than where the binding started. Just straight across. So I have the last end of the binding about 1 inch longer than the start of the binding. And I'm just going to tuck the end of the binding inside the finished edge of the first part of the binding. And you can pin this if you want to make sure it stays nice and tight. And then I'll just continue sewing this seam and make sure I stitch over this seam really well. And then continue sewing to where I had started. There are lots of different ways to finish these bindings, but I find that this is the easiest way for me. So we have a finished edge on both sides, and when I turn it, I'll just make sure that this part of the binding is tucked under nice and securely before I top stitch over it on the other side of the quilt. That's where they meet, right there. I stitched a few times. And now I'm to my starting point, and I also back stitch. So here's where the end of the binding and the beginning of the binding met, and this is a finished edge on front and back. And this is not sewn in. I just have to make sure that's tucked in nice and tight when I top stitch it on the other side. Okay, so now I want to iron the binding flat from the back part of the quilt. And I use a hot steam iron to do this, to make sure it's nice and flat, because I'm going to be turning this to the other side and top stitching it, and I want it to be laying nice and flat. And the same with these corners and this part where the two ends of the binding met. Make sure everything is nice and flat. Okay, so the last step is to top stitch. And I just turn the binding over to the front side, and I top stitch on the binding about 1/8 of an inch from the edge. And you can use these little clips. I got these on Amazon and they came in this cute little tin. And these are nice because they're easy to put on and easy to take off, and they don't scratch you like pins do. So you can just use these on a small section and keep everything in place, and then top stitch and remove them and move them to the next section. Or you can just put them all the way around the quilt. And I'm starting on the binding where the two ends met, and I want to make sure that the end of the binding is tucked into the beginning of the binding really nice and flat, and I'm going to top stitch over it a few times to make sure it's nice and tight and secure. And when I folded this binding over to the top, I made sure that it covered the stitch line from when I sewed the binding on the back of the quilt. And back stitching. And you will see the stitching on the back part of the quilt, and that reminds me I wanted to use a light blue so that this stitch line doesn't show. So I'm going to change the bobbin to this lighter blue thread so that stitch line doesn't show on the back part of the quilt. Okay, so I'm at the corner, and I'm going to fold the binding up on the next edge first, and then making sure I have a 45-degree angle in this corner, I'm going to overlap this part of the binding on top of it. So I'm just trying to get a 45-degree angle there and having it laying flat. When I do that, I continue stitching, catching the needle in this corner here so that both of these lay flat. And so now the needle caught into both sides of the binding in that inside corner. So now I'm going to stitch a little just to make sure that seam is secure. And lift the foot, pivot it, put the foot back down, and continue sewing. And I'm going to back stitch again into that inside corner. And then I'm going to back stitch on that angle. That's what I always do because I like it to be nice and secure. You can also hand stitch it if you want. And continue sewing. So the important thing here is to make sure I'm stitching on top of the binding about 1/8 of an inch in from the edge. And looking at the back of the quilt then, I changed my bobbin thread to this lighter blue. I did have the black thread in it before. So now this line doesn't show as much. And here's my finished quilt. Free motion quilted and with the binding on. And I don't think I mentioned before, but I went with the black printed fabric jelly roll because it works nicely and blends in with the final black border that I put on this quilt. So I'm really happy with the way this turned out. So I hope this video was helpful for your quilt making, and if you like this video, can I ask you to please give it a thumbs up? That really helps my YouTube channel to grow. And can I also ask you to please check my main Gemma's House channel page, because I have a lot of other projects I do in addition to quilting. And if you click on the videos tab, you can scroll through the videos and there might be another video that you're interested in watching. So thanks a lot for watching. I really do appreciate the viewer support. Bye-bye.